What makes discrimination illegal and who must comply? Fair housing is a right for all people to be free from discrimination in the rental, sale, and financing of housing. And that means in the Federal Fair Housing Act, this is Title 8 of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the fair housing covers all aspects of purchasing, selling, renting, mortgage lending, advertising, all of those different aspects that are involved in buying a home or in renting a home. Oh gosh. The Fair Housing Act, discrimination in public and private housing. This is just not for government subsidized housing or government supported housing. It's also for private housing. The bases, and this is important to understand what the bases and issues are. The bases are race and color, and everyone is protected by this. Everyone has a race or everyone has a color. And you may think that color is an antiquated term, but there are still complaints about the color of one's skin in facing discrimination in housing and employment. The Human Rights Commission's main type of complaint that it handles is employment discrimination. And so a lot of the examples that I have may be related to that. Okay, under the next basis would be sex, and that is male and female. And there's an exemption to that. Let me see if I can get it out. We've had a lot of discussion on gender orientation or gender identity and sexual orientation in the last few years. And under the sex discrimination bases, those types of claims are also covered using a different theory. The Fair Housing Act does not specifically state that it protects based upon gender identity or sexual orientation, unless you get into the programs that are supported or funded by HUD. And those program regulations are intended to ensure equal access to the LGBT persons. Okay, so if you're in federally funded housing, then those need to be non-discriminatory based upon sexual orientation and gender identity. Okay. The next is the religion or the lack of religion. You know, if somebody's trying to impose their religious beliefs upon you as a tenant or an owner of a home, then there is a cause for concern and find out if there's a possibility of a discrimination complaint. And it doesn't matter, the religious discrimination is defined as a deeply held religious belief. So we get claims on that too. National origin, we're all immigrants to this country. And so we have to remember that. Our families came from somewhere. You trace your genealogy and you're going to go back to European countries most likely, or to some on the continent over there. So national origin speaks to the nation in which your ancestry came from or the nation in which you came from. So for example, some of the newer immigrants are from the South African countries, maybe the Eastern European countries, and it seems like, okay, what do you want me to do? Can you still hear me on that? Can you still hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, I'm sorry, that's just the way it's going to have to work. All right, national origin, some of the more recent ones, like I said, is from Eastern European countries. It seems to me like every time the United States is in war with a country that there are a lot of people that are being displaced by those wars, and a lot of them are seeking asylum here in the United States or trying to find a new life here in the United States. And so we do have discrimination based upon national origin. And even coming from America is a national origin, or coming from the United States is a national origin. Like I said, these laws cover everybody, not just quote-unquote minorities. Okay, I bet they can't hear me now.
Okay, try again.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Okay. All right, no more lisping. All right. Disability discrimination. We are seeing more and more of this. Of course, the ADA and the Fair Housing Act have both provided disability discrimination. And frankly, those types of cases at the Idaho Human Rights Commission are the highest number of cases that we get filed with our office, is disability discrimination. Familial status is protected under the federal law, not under the state law. Familial status, there's been a lot of confusion on this, and people have tried to interpret what familial status is, meaning marital status between the LGBT community, is that what it's called? It's a marital status. It's not a marital status issue. Okay. It's a familial status, and that means you have children under the age of 18. A pregnant female, because you're going to have a child, is protected under that. Or if you're securing custody, or you are a custodial parent or an adopted parent, then all of those children, if you are discriminated because you have children, then you are protected under the familial status. Okay. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, what issues are covered under the statute? And like I said at the beginning, almost any transaction that you incur in the sale or rental, purchase of a home, or in living in the home is covered. You'll see that renting, buying, terms and conditions, and that would be, for example, sometimes you won't know what the terms and conditions are or whether you're being treated discriminatorily. And that would be something like if a landlord were to charge me $1,000 deposit, but along comes Zoanne and she gets charged $500. One would wonder why the person with the brown skin has the higher deposit, and does it make sense? And so those things you find out as you move in, or if they're offering different terms of the rental rate, those kinds of things are the terms and conditions. Rules, policies, and contracts. Reasonable accommodations. There are some reasonable accommodations that need to be made as far as the terms and conditions of the home. Mortgage lending, appraisals, insurance, and advertising. Okay, you take those bases and those issues and you put them together. Discrimination means being treated differently than others, but not all discrimination is illegal. In Boise, we have sexual orientation, gender identity, protection under the under the city ordinances. Okay, but that's not protected under the state law, and it's not protected specifically under the federal law. There are other things such as your rental history perhaps was pretty spotty. That may not reflect upon you as an individual that would be falling under the protection of the Fair Housing Act. Okay, so there's only about 7 bases that are protected, and those are the bases that we went through at the very beginning. When you take illegal discrimination, it means you've got a covered issue and a covered basis, and you put those two together and there is adverse treatment because of those, then you possibly have an illegal discrimination case, and that's where you seek out the Intermountain Fair Housing Council or the Idaho Human Rights Commission and discuss it with them, and perhaps you may be able to file a complaint of discrimination with them to find out what is going on. Refusing to rent, which is the issue, housing to someone because she is a woman, which is a basis of sex discrimination. You see how that works? You link those two. Okay, what makes discrimination illegal? Discrimination can mean a failure to reasonably accommodate a person with a disability. One example would be like if their funding source sends a check to them on the 5th of the month and the rent is due on the 1st, they will always be late on their rent payment and get late fees unless there is a reasonable accommodation made on that so that they can pay their rent on the 5th when the check comes in, or on the 6th when the check comes in. So those kinds of issues you have to be aware of when you're renting your apartments. Okay, discrimination can mean a landlord's neutral policy when put into practice, this is an adverse impact case, has a greater negative effect on one group of people of a certain protected class more than any other group. And we see that with new emancipated children. When they're 19 years old or 18 years old and they're hunting for their first apartment, they don't have a rental history. And we also see that in the refugee population, where they really, I mean, what is your rental reference when you've lived in a refugee camp for the last 20 years? You know, so there are other ways that you can work out how to confirm and to ensure that you get your rent and that the property will be taken care of and so forth. So just a policy that says that you have to have a certain thing in place, like you have to have 3 rentals that are really good references, may have a negative impact on a certain group of the population. Okay. It can also mean charging a higher rent amount for tenants with children. Okay, because you have a big family, we're going to charge you X dollars and because of the children, or making decisions that would impact the children negatively. Making a tenant follow stricter rules because he is Russian. And this is based upon stereotypes. You know, and you can put in any national origin in place of Russian. You know, the stereotypes that come into mind would be, you know, maybe they don't take care of their housing as well as other people do, and so I'm not going to rent to that group of people. And that would be possible discrimination complaint in that regard. Charging a pet deposit or a fee for a service animal. Okay, pet deposit is for pets. Service animal is not a pet. And we have to think in those terms. A service animal is not a pet. And a service animal may be an assistive animal, may be a companion animal, but they are not a pet. And so you don't charge them. They are like having a cane or a wheelchair. They help you to enjoy the premises and help you to live your life with the help and the assistance of those animals. Requiring a qualified applicant to meet higher standards because she's African American. Okay. Evicting a disabled tenant because she requires a reasonable accommodation and needs a ramp for her disability. There are many issues that come up in disability discrimination that can be discussed and resolved. And the Human Rights Commission are real advocates of mediation, as is the Intermountain Fair Housing Council. If they can get things resolved early on, it saves everybody a lot of time and effort. However, with individuals or respondents or landlords or companies that continue to not want to resolve the dispute, it becomes a very costly process. Telling applicants that an available apartment has been rented once it is known that the renter is a Muslim. Okay, so you get a phone call and somebody says that they want to rent your apartment, and so then they show up and they were not the same people that you were expecting based upon that phone call. All of a sudden now the apartment has been rented, just barely rented since they called. You know, it raises red flags, and they will question it. We will question it as enforcement agencies to see what happened. Okay, if anyone contacts HUD or the Idaho Human Rights Commission, the Intermountain Fair Housing Council, to discuss a complaint of discrimination. They are protected from retaliation. So, for example, if you are a landlord or a manager, managers are the ones that generally get into difficulties in the discrimination aspects. The owners may not know, but the managers of the apartment complex or the home or the rentals are the ones that usually tie up the owner in these types of complaints. That's been our experience. So, for example, the manager finds out that so-and-so, in this apartment here, contacted the Human Rights Commission. They may not have filed a complaint. They may have just called for a question. And all of a sudden, the manager says, oh, they called the Human Rights Commission. So now I have to do everything I can to get them out of here because I don't want to have a complaint. You've just made yourself a complaint by doing that. If you take steps because they in retaliation for them having called the Human Rights Commission, then that is retaliation, and they can make a claim on that. If you find out that so-and-so over here was a witness to an investigation or provided some type of information that would be part of that investigation to the Human Rights Commission, and you decide to take some action against them because of their participation in the investigative process, then that person is protected as well from retaliation. So oftentimes in the employment setting, we have a complaint that is filed, and then the employer retaliates against them. The initial complaint may have been no probable cause, but the retaliation, because of the action that they took, stands and becomes a strong complaint. And we had a complaining party that called in, or a party that called in. The boss found out about it, and within that day, they were fired. And so we could track timeline on that, and the retaliation stands. If you have to prove it, but it still is a stronger case than the initial filing. So that's a real concern that we need to be aware of. Failing to take action if a tenant complains that another tenant is harassing them because they are Mexican. Okay, so I'm not Mexican, and so then I get tired of hearing my neighbor yelling at all the people that are Mexicans in the apartment complex, and they're just very rude, just harassing them. So I go to my manager and I said, so-and-so is doing this, and I'm really tired of it. The manager has been placed on notice that there's possible discriminatory activity going on in the apartment complex, and they are now obligated to take some sort of action. They would need to investigate and find out what's going on, and may have to take further action as a result of that. If they do not act, then that would be not a very good move on their part, because the harassment would continue and not have been addressed, and so the complaining party could file a complaint of discriminatory treatment. Who must comply with the Fair Housing Act? Any person or entity involved in the rental, sale, dwelling, advertisement of a dwelling. So it covers virtually everything. Any person or entity involved in real estate, related transactions such as mortgage lending, property, hazard insurance, zoning, and municipal services. So it can even go into the city because of the zoning code in this area says that you can't do certain things, and it has an impact on a minority group or on somebody that is protected by the Fair Housing Law. And I put managers in bright red because that's who we deal with a lot, and that's the person that generally gets into trouble. And so my suggestion to you, if you're an owner of a housing, to make sure that you screen your managers and make sure that they are aware of what the fair housing laws are, and that there would be no, when you are not on the premises, that you want them to be able to make proper decisions instead of getting you into trouble by saying things that would prompt a complaint to be filed with the Human Rights Commission. Okay. Other issues that are specific to fair housing. Okay, sexual orientation. Remember I said sexual orientation, familial status, and advertising. Remember I said that sexual orientation was not covered. Sexual orientation and gender identity. Those 4 words are not included in the Human Rights Act. They're not included in the Federal Fair Housing Act. And they are not protected per se. However, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender persons experience with sexual orientation or gender identity housing discrimination may still be covered by the Fair Housing Act. And like I said previously, if you are funded by the U.S. government, by HUD, then they are already protected under those statutes. Okay. A gay man is evicted because his landlord believes he will infect other tenants with HIV or AIDS. Okay. That complaint could be filed under the disability discrimination. Because disability is whether you have a disability, whether you've had a record of a disability, or whether someone perceives you as having a disability and treats you based upon those assumptions. A property manager refuses to rent an apartment to a prospective tenant who is transgender. Okay. The way we look at it under the Human Rights Act and under the federal law, besides these aspects here, is if the tenant is not behaving in a stereotypical male or female fashion. Okay, so if I was acting more male than I was female and you had a question, well, I don't know about that, and you treated me wrongfully because of that, I would be able to file a complaint and saying that I did not fit the stereotypical mold of what a female is, and so they think that I am, you know, a protected group member here under the sexual orientation, gender identity bases. Okay. Familial status. What is familial status? Okay. Do's and don'ts, and then occupancy, and then the housing for older persons, housing for older persons, and that's the exception to the familial status rule. Okay, and I've got the different pictures just kind of depicting, and remember, it's up to 18 years of age. The children are protected under the familial status. The presence of one or more children under the age of 18 in the household, parent, step-parent, adoptive parent, guardian, foster parent, or custodian, pregnant women, or someone who is going to be acquiring legal custody of a child. Okay, that would be the adoption. Okay. Do not refuse to rent to qualified families. There's a lot of again, there's a lot of confusion about familial status, and that is a federally protected basis. And so remember that the Human Rights Commission's statute does not cover familial status, and so you would need to call HUD or the Intermountain Fair Housing Council for questions regarding that. Do not refuse to rent to qualified families with children unless you are a housing for older persons. Don't make assumptions about the safety hazards. Because I have a swimming pool, I'm not going to rent to families with children. Okay. We just heard of an incident where a manager is having all the older adults in this particular part of the apartment complex and all the families with the small children over in this part, because the assumption is the grandparents do not like the grandchildren. Okay, I mean, it's just that way. The older persons do not like to have the noise from the children, and so therefore the manager has taken the responsibility upon themselves to segregate, and that is a violation of the statute there. Do not limit families with children to certain floors of buildings. For example, I have an apartment on the first floor or on the second floor, and I decide that I'm only going to rent to families on the first floor because heaven forbid that they should fall off the second floor and injure themselves. Okay, that's based upon an assumption, and the likelihood of that happening is very slim because you've taken all the protections to protect anyone from falling off the second floor. So making decisions because you're exercising benevolent protectionism that means you think you're protecting them from the potential of harming themselves, then that is also something that could be filed as a complaint with the Human Rights Commission and the Intermountain Fair Housing Council. Do not establish rules that target children. Okay, swimming pool hours seems to be a really hot topic in this area, or the jacuzzi, you know, that only certain times, or they cannot get into it, for example. You need to remember to follow the existing health and safety laws when setting those age limits on that. Okay, under certain circumstances, a housing provider's occupancy policy may have an unfair or large negative impact on families with children. And how they address that is that there was a memo, it's called the Keating Memo, and you can see the web page on that if you want more information on that particular memo. And the suggestion there is that a reasonable occupancy policy is 2 persons per bedroom, as a general rule, is reasonable. However, reasonable is not solely determined by the number of people permitted for each bedroom. Okay, how many grew up in a home that had multiple children in a bedroom? We survived. Okay. So you have to take into consideration the size of the bedroom units, the age of the children, how the house is situated, how the layout of the house is. For example, you may have a den, and do you use the den for a bedroom or a place to sleep, or is it just strictly a den? So you have to take those things into consideration. So it's the total livable space. Other physical limitations of the house, you have to determine that. And then state and local laws, for example, like for the health and safety and for the water supply, sewer systems, and those kinds of things. So you have to take all of those things into consideration instead of arbitrarily making a decision that you're only going to have 1 child per bedroom. And you generally do not count children under the age of 2, and some have suggested under the age of 5. Okay, because they can, a lot of times they stay in the parents' bedrooms for a while. Okay? Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination, except for there are 3 exceptions to this rule against families. State and federal housing programs designated by HUD Secretary to be specifically for the elderly. And this is not something that all of a sudden you have an apartment complex and you decide, I'm just going to rent to seniors, and so you decide you're going to discriminate against families until you meet these percentages that are required under HUD to have senior housing. 62 and plus housing is a facility that is intended solely for those age 62 and older, and that means all of the tenants, 80% of the tenants, I guess it is. No, all of the tenants are 62 and older. And then there's another exception where it's 55 and older, and that means 80% of its occupied units is occupied by 1 person at least age 55 and older. And usually they have some sort of amenities and things like that that are specifically geared to the older population or the senior population. And like I said, this is not, you don't have a transition period. This housing, the housing for older persons, has to be in the incorporation or in the documentation that you get from HUD. You cannot just say, I'm going to be housing for older persons without having those exemptions going through HUD, and you will get the documentation, so forth. Questions? No questions, good deal. Advertising. This is where, under the HUD, clear back in the very back, there's a question. How is the Fair Housing Law affected by the Religious Freedom Law? I don't know how that would affect that. That would seem to me like a... You're going to talk about... Oh, right. You were going to get the answer later on. All right? And if you have questions about reasonable accommodations and other aspects that we've covered, we've got different people that are coming up on the program that will address those things specifically, so that helps me. I'm just doing an overview, okay? Gearing up the questions that you have for later. Okay. When we talk about advertising, like I said, HUD has only jurisdiction down to a 4-unit housing. And the Human Rights Act goes down to 2 units. And you have the owner-occupied units that are like in a duplex. If the owner lives on one half of it, then they can determine who lives on the other half. If you rent a house and you're not living in it, then that house is jurisdictional under the Human Rights Commissions Act. Under HUD, if you advertise that house or you rent more than 4 in a particular year, you're jurisdictional under the HUD, the Fair Housing Act, because of the advertising. It reaches down to the lowest number of units on that. Some of the things that you can say are master bedroom, desirable neighborhood, female roommate wanted. Remember I said, you know, if you have a roommate that wants to come in, that you want to have come in and live in your home, then you can determine who that roommate is going to be. A mother-in-law suite, no smoking. Smoking is not a protected category. Family room, okay? Some of the things that you want to avoid is a white family house. Is that a white house, or is that for whites only? Okay, it would confuse, wouldn't it? And so you don't want to do that. Describe the home, not who you want to have live there. Adult communities, we see this often. And like I said, under a Housing for Older Persons Act, remember that's the only exceptions to the familial status. And so if you have adult housing and they were not incorporated as such, they're not meeting the requirements for the exceptions, and they are most likely being in violation of the Fair Housing Statute. Rose Lawn Catholic Home. What's the problem with that? You have a reference to a religion, and the only way you can do that is if you do a non-discrimination statement along with that. We do not discriminate on the basis of race, sex, religion, age, national origin, or handicap. Okay. What about no pets? Okay, no pets. Pets are under reasonable accommodation, and Zoanne will address that this afternoon and get into it all along. And remember, I said pets are pets. Service animals are service animals. Keep those separate. The key is to describe the property, not the tenants that you want. Okay, who do I contact? The Intermountain Fair Housing Council. Right, and Zoanne has cards out on the table if you want to get a card for that, so that you can have contact information. And then the Idaho Commission on Human Rights, and inquiry at humanrights.idaho.gov, or the humanrights.idaho.gov is our homepage, our webpage. So, thank you very much. I think I'm within time. Any questions now? One question here, it looks like.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Oh. I work for the State Emergency Management Agency, and one of the things we've been discussing is emergency sheltering and how that follows under these laws. So do you have any advice? You know, if we had to evacuate and put people into a shelter, are we required to follow all this because it's under an emergency, or?
Zoanne, are you familiar with that?
I have to eat the mic, you guys. So after Katrina and the other subsequent disasters that we've had in this country, there has been a lot of thought put into emergency evacuation, and that it should comply with the Federal Fair Housing Act as long as the people are intending to stay in that particular shelter or shelter facility for a period of time. That is their home. And so you as a community need to make plans to make sure that they can have their service animals, that they have accessibility features that are as best you can to accommodate those persons with disabilities, that you address, of course, your safety and your other concerns. So yes, it's different than a shelter that the only ones that come to mind are the ones in Seattle where they are truly emergency, where someone comes just for the night and then they have to leave the next day and have no guarantee that they will be able to return to their bed the next day. And so those are the differences. If it's somewhere that they intend to stay night after night and remain, and it is their home, they're treating it like their home, that the Fair Housing Act applies. Will there be exceptions? I don't know. That is something that our emergency services, FEMA will decide. But remember, when there's a conflict, with Wendy talks about the Religious Freedom Act, there are conflicts between federal laws, and typically the more broad, more inclusive, more protective act supersedes. Or you get the Fair Housing Act, typically if it's more protective than the Emergency Act, the Fair Housing Act is going to apply because we want people to be able to stay somewhere and be safe. A lot of people wouldn't leave their homes in Katrina because of their service animals or because they needed something because of their disability, so be aware of that. I wanted to just say that under, Wendy is going to talk about the Religious Freedom Act, there is a religious exemption under the Fair Housing Act for operators of free religious housing. Intermountain Fair Housing Council lost a case against the rescue mission for that. And so as long as you're a member of that religious organization and they run a free shelter, the fair housing exemption applies only to the religion, but does not apply to any of the other protected bases. So they can't discriminate based on race, disability, color, etc. So I just want to make sure, I don't know if Wendy was going to touch on that, but I wanted to make that point since Sarah gave me the opportunity. Any other questions?
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Hi, I'm in the property management industry, and I am curious if a homeowners association can adopt the rules of the homes housing for older people through their CCNRs if they go through HUD to do that. Is that a possibility? And if so, how would you advertise such?
There's no transitioning from regular housing.
It has to be established.
It has to be established from the beginning as housing for older persons. If you're transitioning, see, then you're discriminating against families.
Okay. Are there homeowners associations out there that you're aware of that do have established that from initial?
There are housing that has been established. I don't know if it's homeowners associations, but there's housing that has been established from the get-go, from its incorporation, that is directed to older housing. But you cannot transition. I can't, if I had an apartment complex and everybody was living in there and I wanted to transition to older housing, no. I cannot transition because that means that I would be, for a period of time, discriminating against families to try to reach that status.
There's
Okay.
entire cities that are meant for 55 years and older. Look at Arizona. There you go. There's entire cities that do not have a school in the entire city because it's meant for 55 years and older. There's still one. There's still one down there. There's still one down there. It's near Sun City, but it's not Sun City.
Sarah Anderson's going to talk about HOAs tomorrow. So I hope you come here because she's going to talk about it from the housing attorney perspective. So I hope you come to that tomorrow.
Any other questions? Okay. We'll take a few moment break while we transition to the new speaker and hopefully fix the mic thing.
talk pretty loud. She's a tiny talker. So here comes Phil down. Yeah. Don't walk as much. This Phil's.
Oh, he doesn't like it?
He was
Oh,
following
God, I
you.
forgot about that. I'm a
You're
walker.
on camera.
I'm a walker talker.
Yeah. You're on camera.
So
Sorry,
where's the
Phil.
cameras right there?
I'll go take the test off.
Wendy, it's so cute.
Mike's on.
Good job.
Still that town. Do your intro. Wendy Olson. Attorney General's office. There you go.
U.S. Attorney's Office.
U.S. Attorney's office.
That's all right.
Wendy, is that you? Or which
Yes,
one?
that's it. That's the. Yeah, I've got two, but that's the first. That's the one. So down is supposed to be forward.
Did you roll it down on the slide? Do you have notes and stuff to use it in this? Or how to get it out of this mode?
That is. It's not going to matter. I'm not. I usually wander.
Yeah?
Uh huh. Are you the camera guy too? Is that going to cause you problems?
As best as you can. Stay, but if not.
Can they ask tenants to not smoke in their apartments? And would that get them into litigation?
I don't
just
think so.
thought, well, I don't think
It's not a protected.
it's not
Claire.
a protected basis, and I just wondered if you wanted to mention that.
Yeah. Okay. Pardon?
Start this real fast.
Okay. Do you need?
No, this button right here.